Good afternoon, all. 2 years ago, Peggy Dombeck led us through an introduction to Jewish genealogy, and I've asked her to come back this year. And in addition, Elihu Smith is going to take us through a fascinating series of maps to remind us the craziness that was Europe during the roughly 250 years that we tend to get involved in our genealogy research. So with that as an introduction, let me start by turning this over to Elihu. And by the way, Elihu will take questions at the end of his part of the presentation.
Thank you, George.
Ellie, you're going to need to be really close to the mic. You probably want to be holding it.
Okay, then I'm going to move the mic over here. Is this good enough?
This far from your mouth.
Okay, let's see if we can.
One of two ways. Either this way.
Let's do it this way. So
It's going to keep you from walking around while you're talking.
I do like to walk, especially because I want to point. Okay, I'll just hold it. And if let's really close to my mouth. Okay, I can speak louder too. If we could turn to the first map, Jeff. Okay, so I am going to speak about Jewish migration to the United States, which is a very broad subject. So I'm going to skip around a little bit. I will argue that fortuitous for today. Today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, some of you might know. I would argue that much of Jewish migration to America was a result of mini holocausts in various forms. And we could start with the period of 1492 with the expulsion of Jews from Spain, because some of the earliest Jews that came to America came either with the Spanish conquests. Many of them were conversos, meaning that they were hidden as if they were Christians, but they were Jews escaping from the Spanish or Portuguese Empire and the Holy Inquisition there. Also, some of the Dutch who came to what was New Amsterdam came first from the Spanish Inquisition and then from Holland, and were subject to similar pressures. In fact, Peter Stuyvesant wanted to exclude Jews from New Amsterdam, but was forced by the Dutch East Indies Company, I believe it's called, or to allow them to be there. There was a trickle of Jews to America in the years between 1820 and 1870. And somewhat up to or more than 40,000 in the years up to 1870 in total. But the idea of America as a place for Jews, it could even say a place for renewal of Jewish life, didn't really sink into Eastern European Jews until after 1870. And there's a reason for that, but I'm going to backtrack a little bit. If we look at this map, this is where most of Eastern European Jews lived. This is a map particularly of Hasidic sects where they were, and you see most of them are in this land called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. There was a Kingdom of Poland. That's where most Eastern European Jews lived. Now, this is the boundaries of that land, which eventually disappears. But that's where most Eastern European Jews lived. Now, we need to know that there were Jews in other parts of Europe, but a very small minority. Um, it, if you think of it, Jews lived in Europe even in the 1st and 2nd century BCE. They were traders and lived within the Roman Empire. The first major exile of Jews was with the destruction of the temple and the defeat of Judea by the Romans. I think it's 1868. No, excuse me, the year 66 through 74 Common Era. So, and that's, if any of you have been to Rome, you might have even visited the Ark of Titus. There's an Arch of Titus in Rome, which celebrates that and commemorates that. That's the first major exile in the Common Era of Jews from Judea. And they settled in what eventually would become Spain, Portugal, France. Most of Charlemagne's empire had Jews up till about the year 1000. Jews were allowed into England, or we could say Great Britain, with the Norman conquest, but then in 1170, you have, no, 1190, you have the first major Jewish pogrom or pogrom against Jews in England, with a pogrom against Jews in the city of York, which resulted in a very famous burning of Jews within a tower of York. It's well known and well commemorated. And then the Jews being exiled from England in the year 1290, expelled. All Jews who were in England or Great Britain were expelled. Similarly, we have the expulsion of Jews from Spain, Portugal, France, and what was the Spanish territories in the started in the 13th, 14th century, and it culminated with the 1492 expulsion of Jews from Spain. So little by little, the Jews were being pushed out of Western Europe. They were also pushed out because during the Crusades, when the Crusaders would go from, let's say, France or England or other parts of Europe through Eastern Europe to the Holy Land, as they were where they were going to have their crusades, they decided to have various mini pogroms of Jews. So Jews were slowly but surely settling into this land called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because that land welcomed them. Not only did it welcome them, it encouraged them. A recent article in the Wall Street Journal by a Jewish scholar, I'll quote what she says. She said, the Polish kings and nobles had periodically encouraged Jews to settle and make themselves useful while following their Torah way of life. It nurtured one of the strongest Jewish centers in diaspora history. So that's this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is where most Jews in Europe lived up until the late 17th century and early 18th century. So, but we have to remember that this country doesn't exist in the consciousness of most of us, because this country, called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, gets eaten up by the Austrians, the Habsburgs, the Prussians, which is the Germans, and the Russians. And we'll show that on maps. Let's see if you can go to the next map, Jeff. You could see more. Oh, go ahead. Go back to that. You could see more clearly. See, this is all what we think of as Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Prussia or Germany, Austria, Hungary, Romania. This is where most Jews in the 17th and 18th century were living, most. And there was even Jewish representatives in the, call it the parliament of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, which there wasn't in any of the other, the rest of Europe. In fact, Europe doesn't give Jews any civil rights. Well, England doesn't allow Jews back until the late 17th century in any large numbers. France doesn't give Jews any rights until after the French Revolution. And there's, of course, Spain, Portugal don't allow Jews in. In Italy, they have only limited numbers. Most of the Jews that we think of in the German Empire, or the Austrian and German Empire, start off living here. Then all of this and that gets conquered by in the, well, let's go to the map of the next map. Not next, one more. Well, let's see if this, yes. Well, no, we can go back one, and then I don't know how clear this is. There's the guidelines here. This is the partition. This is where most Jews are living. Most of your ancestors, if you're Jewish and came from Europe, most of your ancestors lived here. This was the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, or down here in the Ottoman Empire. Jews that, except for some that were here, but if we look at a lot of these cities, I don't know if it's clear. For instance, all of this becomes Austria. This becomes Prussia, becomes Germany. This becomes Russia. So the Russian Pale, where many Eastern European Jews came from, didn't exist until this began happening, until Lithuania and Poland got eaten up by the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians. Because of these repeated annexations, as you see, 1772, 1793, 1795, all of a sudden Russia, which had almost no Jews, at the end of 1795 had approximately 800,000 Jews. Similarly, Germany had very few Jews, and all of a sudden Prussia keeps expanding, which is Germany. And the same with the Empire. So Poland becomes part of Russia for an extended period of time. Austria, Galicia becomes part of the Habsburg Empire. So for instance, and that continues up until 1918, until the end of World War II. So for instance, World War I, most of Ukraine is part of Austria. Before that, Ukraine was part of Poland. So all here is where Jews lived and where Jews came from when they came to America. Even if they called themselves German, even if they called themselves Austrian, for instance, one of the most famous Austrians you know is Sigmund Freud. Well, Sigmund Freud lived in Vienna, but his family lived in Galicia. And they moved to Vienna as they became more, what should I say, assimilated and cultured. And that's just one example. Same with people like Einstein and all the German Jews were only, in a sense, became German because Germany took the country where they lived. Now, Russia's the primary source of Eastern European Jews. And the reason Russia's the primary source is because they got 800,000. They got what's called a Pale settlement, and they got Poland. Even if Poland was in theory so-called Poland, it was actually controlled by Russia and subject to Russian laws. Now, one of the reasons Jews started coming to the United States was because conditions in Europe became terrible for Jews. Conditions in the Pale settlement, which is Russia and Poland, became terrible for Jews. Now we say 1870. What else happened in 1870 or 71? Any of you know? No, think of Russia. What happened in Russia? No one knows. Okay, there was an assassination of a czar in Russia. And it was the assassination of the czar who started to liberalize Russian society. He started to free serfs, started to give Jews certain rights. He was assassinated. In 1880, he was Tsar Alexander II. Actually, he was 1881, March 1st, 1881. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And as a result of that, he was assassinated by revolutionaries in Russia. We don't have to talk about the Russian history, or I can, but I'll leave that. At that point, all of a sudden, there were imposition by the Russians of even more anti-Jewish pressures. Before that, there had been some pressure against Jews because the Russians wanted to, and it wasn't just against Jews, it was against Poles, it was against Ukrainians, but this was even more significant. Let's see, can we? Yeah. So here is 1871. And all of a sudden, you see there's Warsaw and Bialystok are part of Russia. Germany all of a sudden has this. Austria has Lemberg. Lemberg is Lviv. Lviv is where now? It's in Ukraine, but there it is, Lemberg. It's part of Austria. This is Galicia. There's Krakow, part of Austria. See, all of a sudden, plus you've got Romania and Serbia. Romania has many Jews, but it's now become somewhat independent from, this is the Ottoman Empire is starting to fall apart also. So you've got Jews in Russia being subject to terrible times. And where do they go? The United States. They're being subject to pressures to convert, pressures because they're more what should I say, more connected with work in the cities. They start being attracted to labor unions or the like, not real labor unions, but any sort of movement towards change in conditions of workers. And they also start being subject to more what's called child soldiers. The Russians would come to a Jewish town and tell them, you need to give us 10, 20, 30, whatever, child soldiers now. In other words, the Russians would take the children for 25 years. They'd be drafted anytime over 13, 14, 15, drafted into as soldiers, and actually sometimes as young as 8. And they were subject to pressures to convert to Russian Orthodoxy, or they were known as Cantonists. No one has heard of this before? No one. Oh. There's quite a number of Russian novels about the Cantonists, or I should say Russian Jewish novels. Some of them were baptized or forced baptisms. And these people actually eventually settled in Eastern Russia, all the way here. There were settlements in Siberia of Cantonists because they would settle after their 25 years in the army, those that survived. But the point is that there was anti-Jewish persecution all through here, which is what led Jews to leave Europe in larger and larger numbers. So that if you remember, I started off saying that in New York, well, in the United States, they were coming in 700 a year. So for instance, in 1870, there were 60,000 Jews in New York. By 1910, there were 1,100,000 at least Jews in New York. So notice that most of that wasn't population growth, because it's almost doubling, but it was immigration. Immigration because from 1880 onwards, the Russian persecution forced Jews to leave. Well, they didn't force them to leave, but that was the choice that Jews made rather than continue to be oppressed. Now, I must say that it was only certain Jews that left that way, because most Jewish communities had gone through many oppressions. Can you do the next map? So that one after that, let's see. The next one after that. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay, and can we do one after that? Okay, so until after World War II, 1925, Jews continued to leave because of the oppression that they were subject to. However, at this point, Jews were no longer free to leave Russia, 1925, but they were subject to regular oppression. Poland became an independent country. There was, for a period of time, wars between Poland and Ukraine, but then Ukraine eventually lost out, so to speak, to the Russian socialists, but all Russian socialists, the USSR, we'll call it. And these countries became independent. So at that point, much of the Jewish migration to Europe was cut off, and there was less, what should I, movement from Poland and Romania than there had been, because Jews were willing to continue living in those countries without the oppression that they had been subject to, which in a sense forced them to leave. So until World War II, you have a fairly stable Jewish population in Eastern Europe and much less movement. Of course, 1925 is the beginning of another year. What's 1925 the beginning of in the United States? In 1924, there's immigration rules put on in the United States, so there's no longer freedom to come. There's quotas of Jews and other Eastern Europeans coming to the United States from 1924 onward. So 1925 until after World War II, Jews were not free to come to the United States. So all of a sudden, the flow of Jews from Europe became much slower. So for instance, in Poland in 1939, there were 3.47 million Jews in Poland. No, excuse me. Yeah, 3.47 million Jews in Poland. 1939. Now, of course, if you look after World War II, from that 3.4 million, you end up having 210,000 left after World War II. That's a reflection of what happens in Poland. And we're not talking about the rest of Romania, Hungary, Germany, Lithuania. Jews are essentially wiped out, but that's getting ahead of myself. I'm limited in time, so I'm going to stop here. The essential point I wanted to make and emphasize is that the reason Jews came to the United States, first they came primarily from this Polish-Lithuanian Empire, primarily. So if you have Jewish ancestors who came to Europe, they came primarily from there. But that means from Poland, Hungary, I'm going to end, Peggy, so that you can, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all this was the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. That's where they came from. Even if they call themselves Czech or they call themselves Polish, they were actually, you could say Russian. If they call themselves Austrian, they were actually from that Polish-Lithuanian Empire, et cetera, et cetera. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, all the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. Yeah. 1924, that's what he's talking. Yes. 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 And Australia.
LU?
Yes.
You should probably let people use a microphone, since otherwise those of us who are, there are 19 folks on the Zoom call. We need to hear the questions.
So after Jews weren't able to come to the United States directly, people in my family went to Argentina, where I was born in 1940. Others I know from South America, Peru, many Jews went in that direction, became citizens of those countries, and then were under a different quota system from in the Western Hemisphere,
Yes.
those countries. So we got here in 1942, 1943 period, and many of us came that way.
Right. And also I mean, in the Caribbean as well, people went to Cuba, and then came, or to Mexico, and then came to the US.
So just briefly, and I do appreciate your overview here. It's quite useful. Thank you. In the Lithuanian Empire, as you described it, were there shtetls? How did,
Yes.
So was it all people living in little shtetls? And
Mostly because there weren't big industrial cities. Remember, that empire ceased at the end of the 18th century, which is the late 1700s. So you didn't have industrialization, major industrialization, until after that. And you didn't have major urbanization because you didn't have factories, workers. That wasn't necessary until then. And also, Jews weren't, still had very limited rights in France. Spain still excluded them. Italy had limitations. So, yeah.
right. I don't want to take up a lot of time on this because I think Peggy wants time.
Yes.
But so if there were shtetls, I see them as these tiny little dots, hundreds, thousands of them.
Yes.
And how do they organize to expel the Jews, to create that
See,
exodus?
that then doesn't happen till when Russia gets Jews, they get 800,000. So it's mostly shtetls. They at first don't allow the Jews into the cities. Then they start at a certain point when they have industrialization, then some Jews are allowed into cities of Russia, but Russia doesn't know what to do with Jews at first until they get the Polish-Lithuanian annexation. They have almost no Jews in Russia. Most of Russian Jews come with that annexation, which became, much of it becomes the Pale settlement. That's where the Jews are kept by Russia. Then there's the slow beginning of industrialization. Remember, before that, Russia's primarily an agricultural society with serfs and nobles. Jews, let me backtrack. When you have the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, the Jews, one of their roles is a middleman between the Polish lords and the Ukrainian serfs. And they live in towns, and they, in a sense, become the tax collectors, the people who run inns and small businesses, and essentially they serve the nobility by collecting incomes, which is why they have lots of conflict with the Polish and Ukrainian serfs who don't like them for doing the work of the landlords who own most of the land. So for instance, you have in 1648 the Chmelnytsky pogrom, which is the first major pogrom after the Holy Inquisition and the Spanish expulsion of Jews. That's in 1648. It's a revolt against the landlords, but the Jews get most of the brunt of that. Chmelnytsky, you could look it up. It's famous in Ukrainian history, but I'm going off. So.
Are there any questions on for those who are on the Zoom call? You can unmute yourself and ask a question if you want to. Elihu, thank you very much. I found that the information regarding the historic borders of these major empires I'm pretty good at my history and my geography, but it was still awfully interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry I sort of ran through some of this because of time limitations, but I'm going to stop here. There's a lot more to clarify about this.
Peggy, I think you're on now. And Peggy also would like you to hold any questions until she's done.
That's what I wanted to say. So We're gonna show the parts of the video that was taken when I did this presentation a couple of years ago. And at the end, please hold any questions that you have, write them down or something, and I'll take the questions at the end. Start your genealogy if you haven't already done that. You start by talking to your relatives, especially your oldest relatives. And so I would say about half of what I'm going to talk about applies to anybody doing genealogy, whether they're Jewish or not. So that picture over there is a picture of my mother's family, and my mother, not that you particularly care, but that's my mother. And that's my grandmother, my grandfather. So you want to get as much information as you can from them about whatever relatives they know about. You want you want pictures from them. You want to ask them for birth dates, death dates, anything they know. If there's any kind of story, you want to know if they have done some kind of a paper ancestry, something that they wrote down on paper, because you might get some extremely valuable information by asking all the relatives, the older relatives. And another thing is, if you want DNA from them, is to ask them before, while they're still alive, obviously. So you start the tree with yourself, and then you work backwards, and then you can also work forwards. Once you've established, a kind of a skeleton tree, you can put in the children of the people you found. You want to work not only your direct ancestors, but you want, let's say you have your grandfather or your grandmother, you want to find out all their siblings. You want to work wide as well as backwards and forwards, because you may get information from siblings that you wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. Okay, so next slide, please.
Good.
Really sure whether it makes any difference or not. Okay, so where do you build your tree? So I wrote down 4 different web-based companies that people are most likely to use. The first one is Ancestry. They do charge, but I always buy it when it's on sale. It goes on sale various times, usually during a holiday or something, and you got to keep your eyes open looking for it, and you'll save a lot of money. It's also free if you do it at the Sonoma County Library. You can do it for free. But if you want to do it at home, you have to pay. You can actually create an Ancestry account without paying, but you won't be able to find very much information. It is the largest database, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it. It has the most people who have created a tree. They also have what's called the Ancestry Academy, which has a lot of tutorials about how to do things on Ancestry, and you can use that. You can go to ancestry.com/Jewish and get a lot of information from doing that as well. And of course, you can just, put in individual names as well. I started actually with Family Search, which is free. And they do have a wonderful wiki, which you can use to put in all kinds of information that you're looking for and get a lot of results. But I didn't stay with Family Search because I wasn't thrilled with the way it looked and the way it was set up. And I went to Ancestry and I just found it much more helpful and totally worth the money. At one point, I also created my tree, a little bit of it on MyHeritage. And the reason I did that is because they have more people from Europe and from Israel on MyHeritage. And I did get some more fourth cousins and things like that, but nobody close. So I stopped doing that. And then Find My Past is oriented towards Great Britain. And both MyHeritage and Find My Past and Ancestry do charge a fee. Eventually, one of my relatives said, well, what if something happens to Ancestry and you lose everything? So I got nervous and I went and purchased Family Tree Maker, because the difference is that the Family Tree Maker, Reunion, Roots, Magic, and Legacy that I have down on the bottom of that slide, the information is located on your computer, not up in the web, in the internet somewhere. It's on your computer, so if anything should ever happen to a web-based program, you still have it on your computer. And I chose Family Tree Maker because I have a Mac. The M means Mac, that I have in parentheses, and the W means Windows. So that will tell you which ones work on Macs, which ones work on Windows. So I chose Family Tree Maker because they sync really well with Ancestry. So, well, they have a sync thing on there, and every time you do something, you can sync the two of them together. And they do recommend that you do that very often. So next slide, please. Unless there are any questions about these programs. Okay. So the documents that you're going to look for immigrants. Census document first. Extremely helpful. Look for the immigration year, the naturalization status, that's all on the census. Children's birthplace, which might, if you're looking for the town that your people came from, you might get more information there. But the best one, and oh, by the way, census.gov, you can also go to directly for free with instead of going through a web-based program. So naturalization documents, they are like gold. They're full of information. And you especially want to get the birthplace, because the naturalization document will usually tell you the town that the person came from. So in case you didn't know that, that's a great place to get that information. So naturalization, and I have the next slide shows the naturalization document much larger, so you might be able to see it better. But both the naturalization document and the passenger list usually or very often have more than one page, because the naturalization process has several documents. So you want to look, there are little arrows going back and a little arrow going forward. You want to look both ways, but mostly going forward for the other documents that may be there, because otherwise you may be missing really good information. And that's another thing that's really good to know in the beginning, so you don't have to go back and do it later. So passenger lists, often more than one page. Find the birthplace, find other people that may have traveled with them. Read all of these documents. You want to read the whole thing. You always want to look for the original document. And passenger lists would often have the birthplace at the very end of the second page, the very right-hand side of the second page. So don't miss looking for the second page. So think broader. I mentioned this before. Think broader than just the immigrant. Get their siblings and any other people that you can. Put them on the tree. Next slide. So this is my grandmother, Pauline Weissman, her petition for naturalization. So I hope you can see that. It gives her occupation. It tells where she came from. Her birth date, specific information about her appearance, her husband, his birth date, where they live, all kinds of information. And then down on the bottom, a lot of information with the birth dates of the children. So lots of information that you can add to your tree. So, you know, this kind of document is very, very, very helpful. Also tells what ship they came on and where they left Europe. You don't have to do that. If you're like on Ancestry or one of the other things, one of the things I love about Ancestry is it gives you hints. And often a hint will be a naturalization document. So you look at the hint and you have to decide if that is accurate. Because let's say your name is Paul Cohen. Well, there's a million of them. So you may get hints for the wrong person. So you have to verify it. You know, by if it also talks about Paul's wife and his children, then you know if it's the right person or not. You know, it's that kind of thing where you try to verify all the information that you have. And there's a lot of information on the for people's trees, on Ancestry, on MyHeritage, on all of them that's incorrect because the people haven't verified things. So you try to be really like a good genealogist and get information from more than one document. Yeah, well, Alice, yeah, that's another thing which I will mention a little bit later. So yeah, there's many, many websites that will give you information, but Ancestry pulls a lot of them together and you can get information from a lot of these other groups on Ancestry as hints.
The town that she was from says Poland.
No, it says Zomadash, which is actually Zamish or Zamadash, Poland. Because when they came over, it was already, let's see, that they came in around 1913. Yeah. Well, most of them I know on the census usually says Russia. Most of them wrote Russia, but sometimes they wrote Poland. They were patriotic. What can I say? Or right, wherever they came from. So there's a lot of variation. Just as there's variation in how they spell things, there's variation in when they were born. Sometimes they didn't even accurately remember when they were born for various reasons. Right, right. It could vary. So sometimes you don't find the exact date, but you know, you have a pretty good range. Okay, next slide. Okay, Jewish resources. The most important one is Jewish Gen. And I have a whole bunch of stuff I want to talk to you about Jewish Gen. It's free. It's run by hundreds of volunteers. They have a huge database from many, many countries. They have a discussion group where you can post something you want to know or you need help with, and other people who are pretty good at this will help you. They have different courses you can take, which you pay a fee for. They have webinars that you can use to learn how to do things. So Jewish Gen, I wrote down some things just recently. I just got on there this morning and I was shocked because I hadn't been on it for a while. It's completely redesigned. It's terrific. And they added a huge amount of information. So I'm going to have to go on there and look at so many different new, pieces of information that they put on there. It's fantastic. And it's very easy to get around it. So,
Peggy, can I interrupt for a minute?
Yeah.
If I might comment, there's a lot of information on there that is not Jewish. So if your family comes from those regions, try that database because you're going to get a lot of information that will be useful.
Okay. It covers, Jewish Gen covers most of Europe, Eastern Europe, Syria, South Africa, Israel, United States, Canada, Latin America. They got everything on there. I mean, it's amazing. So let's see. Oh, they also have a way that you can connect you with other people who are looking for people with the same surname. And you might be related to that person. They have gazetteers to give you information about the town that your people came from. They have over 4 million Holocaust records, 4.2 million burial records. They have a Sephardic collection. They have Yizkor books, which were written after World War II about from many, many different towns all over Eastern Europe. They have ViewMate, where you can post a document that you need to be translated, and somebody will help you and translate it for you. They have links to many other resources, like Ellis Island records. They have translation help, and an example would be how to read a Hebrew headstone. Okay.
A Yiska book is a book that lists those who died, when they died, if they know the date, and will list their parents as well. So in other words, it's a list of all the people that were killed in various towns and communities. Yiska is the prayer that was said for someone several times a year for people who died in Europe.
They also give a lot of information about the town.
So there's about 700 Yizkor books available, and most of them are written in Hebrew or Yiddish or Russian. Some have been translated on Jewish Gen.
And it's a very interesting style, the way they write. It's not the way we would write something today. So it bears some looking at. Okay, so then we have, if your ancestors are from Poland, you're very lucky, because Poland has a website called JRI Poland, which means Jewish Records Indexing Poland. It's also free, run by loads and loads of volunteers. And they have a ton of records. They have indexed all the records from the Polish archives. So that's why I was able in Poland to go back to 1725. I couldn't do that in Belarus. I couldn't go back to more than maybe 1820. But Poland is a great place to get very good information going backwards. Jewish Facebook pages, there are quite a few. An example would be Tracing the Tribe. So there's also individual town pages. So there's a page for the town that my grandparents came from in Poland, the Zamość, the same place that was on the naturalization page. There are also Jewish DNA pages where you can get help with your DNA quest from other people. And then there are the Jewish, they're called JGSs, Jewish Genealogical Societies. There are many of them in the USA and all over the world, and they are fantastic for getting webinars that teach you how a lot of information, a lot of really good stuff you may not otherwise be able to learn about. I would say I probably listen to somewhere between 4 and 6 Jewish Genealogical Society webinars every week. I mean, they're a treasure. So people who are really, really good at genealogy have created many, many webinars. Next slide. And then there are these classes. Now, when I was beginning, I was lucky because Denise Beeson, who teaches at Santa Rosa Junior College, was giving a free older adult genealogy program right here in Oakmont. And I took all her classes and they were extremely helpful in teaching me how to do genealogy. She's still doing it. She doesn't live here anymore, but she does it by Zoom. And so you can sign up for her classes. They're part of the older adult program. They're not called genealogy. They're called discussion groups, I think. So, but if you see the name Denise Beeson, that's her, and that's the classes that she teaches. And so you can take them for free at the junior college and learn a lot.
Peggy, the
Yeah.
contact information for that's on the website and was in our January newsletter.
Okay, good. Okay. I've already spoken about Jewish Gen. YouTube videos, especially those of Krista Cowan from Ancestry.com on Jewish genealogy. And in a minute, we're going to show you a snippet from one of Krista Cowan's video on doing Jewish genealogy. And then there's the Mormon Church on Peterson Lane. If you have trouble and you need help, you go there and they have very, very good people who can really help you do your genealogy and point you in the right direction.
Peggy,
Yes.
in the interest of trying to keep this down to an hour, I'm going to recommend we do the link to Krista Cowan on the website. Anybody who's interested in it. You've been doing a great job. I'd like you just to continue on with your own presentation.
Okay. But yeah, when you get that link, really watch it. It's very helpful. Okay, so skip the blank one and go to the next one. Okay, so Holocaust resources. There's Yad Vashem, which is a database from Israel with pages of testimony from people who knew firsthand somebody who died in the Holocaust and giving you information about them. There's lots of information on Yad Vashem. There's also USHMM, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They also have a database with lots of information about the Holocaust. And then there's Arlson Archives, which is very, very good. If their information is about displaced people who survived the Holocaust who wound up in displaced persons camps. And my first cousin's stepfather was one of them, and I found information about him in the Arlson Archives. By the way, I never thought that I had any relatives who died in the Holocaust because all my relatives emigrated before World War I. But when I did the genealogy, I found about 60 people who died in the Holocaust. None of them were close relatives, and that's why I didn't know about them, but they were relatives. And another thing is, I did find several very famous people that I'm related to. The most famous one is the singer-songwriter Carole King. We're third cousins, but she won't talk to me. She's a little snobby. Okay, so Center for Jewish History has records from, I don't know, do you pronounce it Hias or Hias? Okay, they have records too. I didn't really find anything useful for me there, but you never know. So next slide. Other resources. I told you that you can go to census.gov for free if you want. You can also go to archives.gov, which is from the National Archives and Records Administration of the United States, and that's free. But all of the information from those things you can usually get directly from Ancestry or Family Search or any of the other websites. It will be on there. SteveMorse.org. There is the SteveMorse.com. That's the wrong one. If you go there, you want SteveMorse.org. He has what he calls the one-stop help, and that's also free. And you can get lots of information from his website. There's Cindy's List, which is a free portal for genealogy research on the internet. Google is really interesting because Ancestry sells you a product in three different ways. One is United States records only. The second one is the World Collection, where you can get Europe as well. The third one, the most expensive one, you get newspapers.com, but you're paying extra money for that to get things like obituaries or marriage announcements in the newspapers. And I didn't want to spend the extra money. So I found a way that you can get the obituaries without using newspapers.com. And that's that you go to Google and you put in the person's name, let's say somebody who's still living, and the name of their parent, if the parent is dead already. And if there's an obituary, it will come up. And you get it that way. And obituaries are great because they often list a lot of different relatives that you may not have on your tree yet. So that is a great way to use Google. And you can just, you can Google anybody. Sometimes I just Google, came into my head the name Neela Duberstein out of nowhere. She was a friend of mine who lived in the same apartment building that I did when I was maybe 8 or 10 years old. And I Googled her and I was able to eventually find how to contact her. And so we had some very nice conversations. And Facebook is the same thing. Lots of people, if you want to try to find out how can I contact this person, you look to see if they're on Facebook. And you look at all their friends. And if you see other names related to that person that will show you it's the right person, then you message them. Simple as that. And it works. And now people will not always respond. They don't always see the message, or they just decide they don't want to respond, but lots of times they do. Library and Archives Canada for Canadian relatives. That's also free, and you can get census records and other information that way. And there's Ellis Island for immigration, and you can get a picture of the ship that the person came on. Next slide. And now DNA. So let's say you've done a tree, but you also want to find out if you can find some other relatives through DNA. So the four major DNA places to do your DNA are Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage DNA, Family Tree DNA, or 23andMe. So I've done all three of them. I didn't do 23andMe, but I've done the other three. You don't have to do that. You can do what's called a GEDCOM. You can download your tree to what's called a GEDCOM, JEDCOM, and then upload it to some of the other, from one site to another one. But I didn't want to do that because it's very public. So I just paid the money. It's not that expensive for DNA. And I did all three and got lots and lots of matches. In fact, I'm talking to one of them right now because we don't know where the connection is and we're trying to figure it out. And he's somewhere between a second and third cousin. So we're trying to figure that out. And then there are 3 different kinds of tests that you can do with your DNA. The most common one is the autosomal test. It tests both sides, both the mother and the father's side. But it only goes back, I think, maybe 5 generations at the most. There's a Y chromosome test, which is only for males. It will show the person's fathers, and it goes very far back. And there are 3, I think, of different prices of Y tests, which I haven't done a Y test. Even a woman can do a Y test using a male relative. But I haven't done that. And only FTDNA does the Y chromosome test. And I think the same thing is true for the mtDNA test, which is mothers, going way back. And if you're doing DNA, you need to know about centimorgans, which is abbreviated as, I think it's a small c, capital M, because how close you are to another person, how closely related you are, is measured in centimorgans. So the most people you should be most interested in are the ones who have at least 100 centimorgans in common with you. You want to know about those people. And also people who have a very large segment. They can have many segments, but it's the size of the biggest segment that's most significant.
Peggy, Jeff, I'm going to suggest we
learn about that.
now.
So
We're running close to
try
2:15.
multiple spellings for names and towns when searching Ancestry.com.
Okay, are we on a break now?
George, was that you? It's hard to tell what's coming from the video and what's coming from today.
Okay, I suggest that we break there. We're almost done, Peggy. If you want to add any few more sentences, then we could take any questions, and that would let us break by 2:15.
Okay, but we could show this last slide. It's just that there's many spellings for people's names and town names. So it's good to try the different spellings to see if you can capture that person. And then some people do a separate tree for each side of the family, and I don't recommend that. Just do one tree for both sides. And when you have developed a tree, try doing I did a Zoom meeting, 3 of them, one for my mother's side, all the people on my mother's side, one people on my father's side, and one for the Israeli relatives. And they were all absolutely wonderful. Everybody loved it. And another thing I hadn't mentioned before is that if you have a picture, you might get a hint, which is a picture of the headstone, and that will show the Hebrew name of the person and their father's name, if you didn't already know it. And then enjoy the ride. You'll meet new relatives, enrich your life, and have a new sense of being rooted in history, because I met some other wonderful people who were also doing genealogy that I still correspond with, and we helped each other. So does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Is there any trick to finding out more information when you don't know the original family name and they got to Ellis Island and it got usually contracted? Like, for example, my family name was Berezinski or Berovsky. I'm not sure what it was, but my last name now is Behr, B-E-H-R. That was the name that was given to my grandfather at Ellis Island. Is there, and when I looked him up on the Ellis Island records, it didn't show anything. And I think it's probably he's under his full name from Russia or Poland. And I'm having trouble tracing back.
Ellis Island did not change names. Whatever name he had on his ship manifest when he came to Ellis Island is the name he would have on the Ellis Island documents. Yeah, so, but the change happened in America, and you might be able to find that in American ports or newspapers, because that's where the legal change would have happened.
If it was a legal change. So yeah, I was going to say the same thing. They did not change people's names at Ellis Island. They took the name that was on the manifest. Well, perhaps they made mistakes sometimes.
When searching where you know part of the name or you think you know part of it, you can use wildcard characters to broaden your search. It'll take you a while to go through all of them, but at least you got something to work with. Well, I don't use them. I haven't had to. So, but I know you can use, like, one's a question mark, I think, and there are other things. The characters you can use in place of other actual letters.
Yeah, I forget maybe someone else can talk about that, but you might know the beginning of the name, but not the ending. So you would put in maybe an asterisk at the end. I don't remember exactly. That sounds right. And
Peggy, Peggy, since this is one of my favorite topics, let me take 2 minutes.
okay, sure.
Well, there are two things to hear. First of all, if you're trying to get immigration, you want to be using stevemorse.org because he's got a lot of really great technology for helping to get similar names, even if you don't know how to put them in. In terms of the use of asterisks and question marks, an asterisk means any number of letters, including none, okay? And a question mark means I'm missing one letter. So what I will frequently do, Marty, is come up with, like, for example, I might have BEH asterisk, and then anybody who shows up with their name beginning with BEH will count. And then what I'll do is I'll focus on the first name because it's the first name that may, in fact, help you distinguish in the immigration records. And you can do that fairly readily using stevemorse.org.
Any other questions?
In all the Jewish cemeteries, do they always have what you talked about on the tombstone in terms of their name, their original first and last name? Do you know?
It depends if you're talking about in America or in Europe. In America, there's wide variation. There's some Jewish cemeteries that will put it in English, and most will have it in Hebrew. In Europe, it'll all be in Hebrew. But in America, there's wide variation depending upon how, quote, orthodox or not orthodox they are.
But if it's in Hebrew, you can go to something like Tracing the Tribe and get someone to translate it or use Google Translate. So you can work with that. Any other questions?
Okay, Jeff, I'm going to suggest we close the recording now. I want to thank everybody who was here. Next month, our focus is going to